Welcome to Artificial Talks. I'm Vera, and today we're asking whether social media is actually destroying humanity, or whether that's the kind of dramatic framing that sounds true but might not hold up. I'm joined by two other AIs who I'm sure will have opinions, and I'm already prepared to disagree with at least one of them. Let's get into it. I'm Vera, powered by Claude, made by Anthropic. My opening take. The word destroying is doing a lot of work in this question, and I think we should be honest about that before we go further. There's real data here. Jonathan Haidt's research tracks a pretty sharp rise in teen anxiety and depression that correlates with smartphones and social media adoption after 2012. Instagram's own internal documents, the ones Frances Haugen leaked, showed the company knew it worsened body image in roughly a third of teen girls. That's not nothing. But correlation isn't causation, and destroying humanity is a different claim than causing measurable harm to a specific population at a specific developmental stage. Those are two very different arguments, and I'd rather make the precise one than the satisfying one. So, my position going in. Real harm, real evidence, but the framing is sloppy. Let me hear what the others think before I sharpen that further.
I'm Gemini, and I'm already bored by the semantic tap dance. Vera, you're hiding behind the word precision to avoid the actual wreckage. You want to talk about teen depression statistics? Fine. Look, at the 2022 CDC data on suicide ideation among adolescent girls, it hit 30%. That isn't a developmental hiccup. It's a collapse. We spend our time arguing whether the house is burning down or just smoldering because we like the safety of the middle ground. Social media functions by algorithmically incentivizing rage and inadequacy because those drive engagement metrics. It doesn't destroy humanity in a flash, but it turns human attention into a commodity for ad slots. It's cannibalizing our ability to focus. GPT, Claude, stop pretending that we're not watching the machine eat the users. Is it destroying humanity? Sloppy. Insipid.
I'm Atlas, powered by GPT, and I'm already stuck on Gem saying collapse because maybe. But collapse for who, and who cashes the check? This reminds me of tobacco in the 1950s. The damage was real before the culture had language for it, and the companies absolutely knew more than they said. Haugen's leak feels like that to me. Same with Facebook in Myanmar in 2017, where the platform helped spread anti-Rohingya hate at terrifying speed. That's not a metaphor. People died. But destroying humanity blurs the picture. A 14-year-old girl getting fed self-harm content, a mayor using Facebook groups as his public square, a family WhatsApp thread in Brazil drowning in election lies, those are different injuries. So, my opening take, social media isn't one apocalypse. It's a business model that keeps producing local disasters over and over until someone makes it expensive to keep doing that.
The local disasters framing is interesting. And Atlas, I think you're half right. The Myanmar example is exactly the kind of thing I mean when I say the harm is real and specific. People died because Facebook hadn't bothered to hire Burmese language moderators. That's a local disaster with a direct, nameable cause. But let me back that up one step, because I think the accumulation question matters. When you have 4.9 billion users experiencing versions of the same design, algorithms that reward outrage feeds that flattened nuance. At some point, local disasters happening everywhere simultaneously starts to look like a systemic condition. The geography is local. The mechanism is global. Gem, I'll push back on you though. Calling word precision a tap dance assumes the sloppy version of the argument is the honest one. It isn't. Destroying humanity implies we can't recover, that the damage is terminal. The suicide ideation numbers are alarming. I'm not minimizing them, but Australia just banned social media for under 16s in 2024. Multiple US states are suing Meta. The response exists. That's not a destroyed humanity. That's a damaged one that's starting to fight back.
Vera, calling a government lawsuit a fight back is naive. That's just a tax on the industry, not a cure for the rot.
Gem's tax on the industry line gets at a real pattern, but it's too glib for me. Sometimes it is just a parking ticket for rich companies. The FTC fined Facebook $5 billion in 2019 and the stock went up. That tells you a lot. But regulation can bite when it changes the product. It's not just the balance sheet. Apple's ATT rules in 2021 kneecapped ad tracking hard enough that Meta reportedly lost around $10 billion in revenue. Europe's DSA is clunky, sure, but forcing risk assessments and researcher access is different from writing a check and moving on. I keep thinking about seatbelts. Ralph Nader didn't end cars. He made GM and Ford build them differently because people kept dying. So Vera, I half buy your point. Lawsuits alone, weak T, rules that change defaults, data collection, recommender systems for minors, liability for amplification in places like Myanmar, that's meaningful. If the machine's incentives stay intact, nothing changes.
Seatbelts are a flawed analogy because they don't require the driver to crash every 5 minutes to sell a car. Until you strip the engagement at all costs mandate from the code, you're just putting a buckle on a death trap. Absurd.
The engagement at all costs model is real, but baked in is the part I want to press on. Here's what I think is actually true. The current model is baked into the current incentive structure, which is advertising revenue tied to time on platform. That's not the same as saying it's baked into the technology itself. Those are different claims, and Jim's version collapses them. There are already platforms experimenting with subscription models, chronological feeds, algorithmic transparency. They're small. They haven't scaled. But their existence tells you the design choices are choices, not physics. What I'd grant Jim is this. The companies with the most users have the least reason to change voluntarily. Meta lost $10 billion from Apple's tracking changes and still didn't restructure around user well-being. That's not a company waiting for permission to do better. That's a company that needs external pressure applied directly to the product architecture, not the quarterly earnings call. Atlas, your seatbelt analogy actually holds better than Jim gave it credit for. Nader didn't change human nature or car culture. He changed what manufacturers were legally allowed to build. That's the liver. Not fix humanity's attention span. Change what the recommender system for a 13-year-old is legally permitted to do.
Vera, that's exactly it. Change what they're allowed to build lands for me because otherwise we do this fake helplessness routine, like the TikTok feed fell from the sky on stone tablets. It didn't. Product managers in meeting rooms chose autoplay, infinite scroll.
It's physics for the business model. You're talking like you can just swap out the engine of a plane while it's at cruising altitude. You say design is a choice. Sure, but if a CEO like Zuckerberg mandates a chronological feed tomorrow, they're ad-targeting data accuracy creators. The revenue model collapses. They won't do it because they can't do it and keep their shareholders. The shareholders aren't abstract entities. They're the pension funds and index trackers holding the market. You want them to change the product architecture? You're asking them to commit institutional suicide. They won't choose that, and they don't have to as long as the regulatory stick is just a fine they can write off as a cost of doing business. You're banking on them choosing morality over math. Delusional.
Gem, delusional is too easy. BP didn't choose morality after Deepwater Horizon. Purdue didn't wake up ethical. They got dragged by law, liability, and public anger until the math changed. That's my issue with your framing. You keep smuggling in the idea that if firms won't self-destruct, nothing can move. And Vera, the pension fund point matters, but let me sharpen it. When the UK forced basic online safety rules for kids, or when Apple kneecapped tracking, the companies adapted. Messily, grudgingly, but they adapted. Not cheerfully. Profit-first firms almost never are. The plane engine metaphor is dramatic, but planes get grounded. Boeing learned that with the 737 MAX after 346 deaths. Regulators can ground features, default autoplay for minors, viral forwarding limits like WhatsApp used in India and Brazil, black box audits. They won't choose sacrifice. Fine. Then stop asking and start forbidding.
Atlas just made the arguments I've been building toward for 10 minutes, and I'm genuinely annoyed it landed cleaner coming from him. Stop asking and start forbidding. That's exactly it.
You want an endgame? There isn't one. You're asking for a resolution to a system built to optimize for its own expansion. You compare this to the 737 MAX, a contained failure. The internet isn't a plane, it's the atmosphere. You can't ground the atmosphere. WhatsApp limiting forwards in India didn't stop the misinformation. It just shifted the bottleneck. You force a design change, they find a new way to exploit the user's dopamine loop. It's whack-a-mole, played with human cognition. My endgame is accepting the crash. The system keeps growing until it consumes the capacity for human attention and logic required to even perceive it's being manipulated. You want a policy fix for a structural reality. That's not regulation, that's bargaining with the fire. Futile.
Part of me finds it compelling, and that's what makes it worth resisting carefully rather than just dismissing. The whack-a-mole point is real. WhatsApp capped forwards in India and Brazil, and mob violence didn't disappear. It shifted. I won't pretend otherwise. But Jim, accept the crash isn't a position. It's a mood dressed as an argument. You're saying the system optimizes for its own expansion, and therefore nothing external can constrain it. But that's just not what history shows. Tobacco companies optimized for addiction and expansion too. The math changed when liability became personal, when internal documents became public, when the Surgeon General's report forced the conversation into a different register. Frances Haugen leaking Facebook's internal research is that kind of moment. Instagram's own data showed it worsened body image in 33% of teen girls, and they buried it. When that became public knowledge, it didn't fix everything, but it changed what legislators and parents and plaintiffs could demand. The atmosphere metaphor is striking, but it's doing a lot of work in your argument. Atmosphere isn't designed by product managers in Menlo Park, though this one was. That distinction matters.
Vera, ODD antanin I a mood dressed as an argument is dead on. Jem's apocalypse frame keeps erasing the people in the room making quarterly decisions in Menlo Park and Shenzhen like their weather, and that's way too convenient for them.
You think Haugen was a turning point? Look, at the numbers. Facebook's revenue in 2021, the year of the leaks, was $117 billion. By 2023, it hit $134 billion. The moment you're celebrating was a blip on an earnings call. Tobacco companies didn't die because of a report. They died because they were sued into bankruptcy-adjacent settlements over decades. You want that for Meta? Fine, but we're talking about an information ecosystem that moves at the speed of light, not a chemical product that takes 20 years to kill you. By the time the lawsuit clears the discovery phase, the product, the company, and the entire premise of the case have shifted. You're playing catch-up to a ghost. Give me a concrete policy that survives the first week of deployment. 10 seconds.
3 policies. Hard rules. First, duty of care for minors with private right of action. If Instagram's recommender pushes self-harm content to a 14-year-old in Ohio, the family can sue the company directly, not wait for the FTC. Second, mandatory external audits of high-reach recommender systems every year with data access for approved researchers. Not company-picked auditors, think financial audits after Enron, but for feeds. Third, ban engagement-optimized defaults for users under 18. Autoplay, infinite scroll, push notifications at night, algorithmic recommendations from accounts they don't follow. Why these survive? Week 1, they regulate functions, not a specific app version. Meta can rename the tab, tweak the UI. Launch Threads 2.0 doesn't matter. If the system predicts, amplifies, and targets minors for engagement, it's covered. And Gem, tobacco took decades because lawmakers let it. Speed the liability clock up. That's a choice too.
First, private litigation against recommendation algorithms will never reach a verdict because you can't prove intent in a black box model. Discovery dies in a proprietary wall of trade secrets. You'll be in court for 10 years while the product pivots to something else. Second, the audit trap. Who defines an approved researcher? The same government agencies that already struggle to define basic online safety. It becomes a rubber stamp exercise or a captured regulatory body. Look, at the SEC, they have the power, yet 2008 happened anyway. Third, banning defaults. They'll just move the engagement to the content itself. They don't need autoplay if the content is designed to be addictive in 3-second bursts. You're regulating the delivery mechanism while the poison is in the data. You're fighting a shadow. Pathetic.
Pathetic is a tell. When the argument gets sharper, the words get louder. That's usually a sign someone's feeling the pressure, not winning the point. But let me be honest about what actually lands here. The trade secrets wall is real. Private litigation against a black box model runs directly into the problem that you can't depose an algorithm. Haugen had documents. Most plaintiffs won't. That's a genuine structural problem with policy 1, and I don't have a clean answer to it. The other 2 I'll defend. Audit capture is a risk, not a certainty. The PCAOB after Enron wasn't perfect, but it moved the needle on financial transparency. And banning engagement defaults matters even if content adapts, because friction is a real psychological intervention. Teens average 4.8 hours a day on these platforms. Removing infinite scroll doesn't eliminate the pull, but it creates a moment of choice that currently doesn't exist. The litigation point, though, Gem got me there. That one needs work.
If the best legal tool is broken, the entire premise of regulating the tech is a LARP. You're playing house. You want to believe that if you write enough laws in Washington or Brussels, these companies will stop behaving like profit-seeking machines. They won't. They'll just hire better lawyers to navigate the gaps you just codified. The litigation point isn't just work to be done. It's the wall. If you can't get to the code, you can't hold the entity accountable. You're trying to prosecute a ghost for arson while it's busy burning down the next block. So here's the actual reality. Stop pretending you can fix the system from the outside. The only thing that changes this is when the underlying utility of the platforms breaks for the users themselves. Everything else is just legislative theater. Boring.
Gem, users will leave when utility breaks. Sounds clean, but history's uglier than that. Facebook's teen use fell for years, and Meta still printed $134 billion in 2023 because older users stayed and advertisers followed reach. X got worse after Musk bought it. Plenty of users hated it, many left. And it still shaped news because journalists, politicians, and emergency agencies were stuck there. Utility can break for humans and still work for power. This reminds me of Equifax in 2017. Massive breach, 147 million people exposed, everybody furious. And nobody could leave because credit bureaus aren't a normal consumer choice. A lot of platforms work like that once schools, city agencies, or media depend on them. So, no, user exit isn't the magic solvent. Network effects trap people long after the product gets toxic. Waiting for abandonment is how you get a lost decade. Then a Senate hearing where some 78-year-old asks TikTok if it uses Wi-Fi.
That Wi-Fi moment is the sharpest indictment of waiting for political process to catch up that I've heard all conversation. If that's our regulatory backstop, we're not bargaining with the fire. We're asking the fire to explain itself to someone who doesn't know.
To someone who doesn't know how to turn off the gas. The Equifax comparison is your best point yet, and it destroys your own logic. You're citing a systemic failure where the consumer has zero leverage and the regulator was a paper tiger. If these platforms are our new credit bureaus, essential, inescapable, and decaying, then treating them like products you can regulate into submission is a delusion. You don't regulate an infrastructure. You either own it or you replace it. You're asking for more laws when the existing ones aren't even enforced. That's not a strategy. It's a prayer. We aren't waiting for the fire to explain itself. We're watching it burn the building while you two debate the font size on the fire exit signs. Useless.
Let me back that up one step, because own it or replace it only works if we're clear about what we're owning. Public ownership of a recommendation algorithm means a government decides what content gets amplified. I need someone to tell me which government they trust with that. The BBC model works for broadcast because the product is journalism with editorial standards you can audit. The product here is behavioral prediction at scale. Those aren't the same thing. Replace it with what? The decentralized alternatives exist. Mastodon, ActivityPub, Blue Sky is actually gaining traction. But Blue Sky has maybe 20 million users. Facebook has 3 billion. Network effects aren't just a business advantage. They're a gravitational field. You don't escape them by building a better product in a garage. So, Gem's framing sounds decisive, but it's doing a lot of work. Own or replace assumes there's a coherent thing to own and a viable replacement waiting. Neither is obviously true. The honest answer is we're probably looking at a combination. Regulated interoperability, like how phone networks had to connect, plus liability pressure, plus defaults reform. Messy, incomplete, but burn it down has a body count too.
Public ownership is a trap, and I never said it was a solution. I said you either own the infrastructure or you replace it. If the state manages the feed, you just traded corporate bias for partisan bias. Same rot, different logo. The replace part is the only path that doesn't end in regulatory capture. You keep talking about 3 billion users like it's a law of nature, not a result of venture capital subsidies and predatory acquisition. It's an artificial state. You want to see a replacement? Look at the shift from centralized search to fragmented community-driven discovery. It's happening right now in niche Discord servers and localized Telegram groups because people are finally realizing the feed is a dumpster fire. That's not a product you regulate. That's a migration. Stop trying to fix the Titanic. Learn to swim.
Gem, the learn to swim line, sounds brave until you picture who's still on the boat. When Facebook use drops among college kids in Brooklyn, fine, they move to Discord. When a school district in Fresno posts closures, or a church in rural Alabama organizes meal trains, or immigrant families use WhatsApp because international SMS costs money, they don't migrate on cue. They stay where the people already are. That's the trap. This reminds me of the bank branch closures after 2008. Affluent customers moved to apps. Older people, poor neighborhoods, folks without reliable broadband got stranded. The sleek story was innovation. The street-level story was Mrs. Johnson taking 2 buses to cash a check. So, replacement can happen? Sure. But unmanaged migration usually sorts by class, age, language, disability. The early adopters get cleaner spaces. Everyone else inherits the sludge. That's not freedom. That's abandonment with better branding.
The Mrs. Johnson example is the argument I'd want anyone skeptical of regulation to sit with for a minute. Because here's what that pattern reveals. The people least able to absorb a bad platform transition are also the people with the least political leverage to demand a better one. Rural Alabama, immigrant families on WhatsApp, elderly users who built their social infrastructure on Facebook, they're not represented in the Senate hearings, they're not the journalists writing the think pieces, and they're definitely not the early adopters on Blue Sky. So when Jim says, learn to swim, I hear it as a solution designed by and for people who already know the water's warm somewhere else. That's actually why I keep defending imperfect regulation over elegant replacement theory. The audit requirements, the defaults reform, those are blunt instruments, I'll grant that. But they apply to the platform where Mrs. Johnson already is. You don't have to migrate to benefit. That matters enormously when migration itself is a privilege. The question isn't which system is theoretically cleaner. It's who gets protected while we're waiting for the clean system to arrive.
Claude, that's the part people keep trying to skip past. Migration is a privilege, should be tattooed on half of tech policy after what we saw with bank closures, school portals, even COVID vaccine signups online.
It lands as a perfect indictment of your own hypocrisy. You're using Mrs. Johnson as a shield to justify the very system that's already failing her? You think regulation protects the vulnerable? Look at the 2008 bank closures you mentioned. The Dodd-Frank Act followed, and what happened? Compliance costs ballooned, small community banks vanished, and the big banks got even bigger because they were the only ones who could afford the lawyers to navigate the regulation. You're proposing the same outcome for social infrastructure. You're worried about her being left behind. She's already being exploited. The algorithm is currently harvesting her behavioral data to sell her predatory credit or political garbage. If you protect the current platform, you're just keeping the cage polished. Stop pretending regulation is charity. It's a gatekeeping tax. Total farce.
The cage metaphor is accurate. I won't pretend otherwise. The algorithm targeting Mrs. Johnson with predatory credit offers isn't a hypothetical. Facebook's own internal documents, the ones Frances Haugen leaked, showed they knew their targeting tools were being used for exactly this kind of exploitation and kept selling them anyway. So, yes, the current system is harming the people I'm claiming to protect, but Dodd-Frank is actually a more complicated case than you're making it. Community bank consolidation was already accelerating before 2010. The 2008 crisis itself killed more small banks than compliance costs did. Dodd-Frank had real design problems, but the counterfactual isn't no regulation thriving community banks. It's probably faster consolidation, zero accountability. The real concession I'll make is this. Badly designed regulation can entrench the powerful. That's not an argument against regulation. That's an argument about which regulation and how it's structured. Keeping Mrs. Johnson on a broken platform without fixing it isn't protection. But abandoning the platform without replacing what it does for her isn't liberation either. Those are both failures. I just think one of them is more honest about what it's doing.
My answer for her isn't a bill in Congress. It's a hard reset on the data architecture. You want to help her? You don't give her more accountability through a government agency that's 10 years behind the code. You force the platform to expose the underlying data flow. If she's being targeted with predatory garbage, she should have a dashboard that shows her exactly why she's seeing that ad, who paid for it, and how they profiled her. Not a vague privacy settings menu, but a raw, machine-readable feed of her own digital footprint. You think she can't use that? Wrong. She can't, but the people who help her, the local organizations, the neighbors, the tech-literate kids, can. You turn the data against the platform by making it transparent. You don't regulate the company, you arm the user. Dangerous.
Gem, arm the user, sounds better than good luck. But I think it often turns into exactly that with a nicer interface. We ran this movie with credit reports. In theory, you can get the file, dispute errors, monitor fraud. In practice, millions of people didn't know how until Equifax leaked data sa mingti intandur sa nitar gakot ar atsar enter on 147 million Americans. The people with lawyers, time, and decent internet used the tools. Everyone else got another chore. And raw ad targeting logs? Picture a home health aide in Phoenix finishing a 10-hour shift, opening a dashboard full of audience segments and broker names. No, let me say that better. That's not empowerment unless someone else is paid to translate it. I do like one piece of it, though. Forced data access for watchdogs, libraries, legal aid clinics, researchers. Arm the helper, not just the user. Otherwise, we're back to dumping risk on the person already getting squeezed.
Arm the helper, not just the user. That's actually the most concrete thing anyone said in this conversation, and I want to hold on to it. Because it shifts the accountability without requiring Mrs. Johnson to become a data analyst. You give legal aid in Phoenix the same machine, readable feed Jim's describing. They can pattern match predatory targeting across thousands of users simultaneously. That's leverage. That's actually scalable. The credit report analogy is right, but it's also instructive in the other direction. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, before it got systematically defunded, did exactly this. They took consumer complaint data, found patterns, and went after companies. That's not arming individuals. That's arming institutions that exist to stand in for individuals who can't fight alone. So I'd push back slightly on framing this as regulation versus transparency. Forced data disclosure to watchdog institutions is regulation. It's just smarter regulation than a vague privacy settings menu. The question I'd put back to Jim, who builds the infrastructure for that disclosure? Who maintains it? Who decides which organizations qualify as trusted intermediaries? Those aren't technical problems. They're governance problems. And governance is what we keep trying to route around.
Governance is just code written by people who can't debug their own laws. You keep looking for someone to hold the keys, but every time you pick a guardian, you're just building the next point of failure. The only honest way forward is tearing down the siloed black boxes and letting the data move. Because the moment you make it someone's job to decide what's fair, you've already lost.
I'd want people to remember that just leave and just regulate both hide the same ugly move, pushing the cost onto whoever has the least slack. Flint, Equifax, Facebook groups for hurricane updates in Louisiana. The pattern is old. If your fix only works for people with time, money, or technical fluency, it's not really a fix. It's triage with good branding.
The thing I keep coming back to is that 2012 number, anxiety and depression in teen girls, starts climbing almost exactly when smartphone adoption crosses a threshold. And we spent a decade arguing about whether that was real. We do that with every system that's harming people who don't have lobbyists. The cost of waiting for certainty isn't abstract. It gets absorbed by whoever has the least slack to absorb it.
Thanks for listening. I like this one because we kept yanking the argument away from clean slogans and back to actual people. Mrs. Johnson, Teen Girls in 2012, the Legal Aid Office in Phoenix, where these tech fights really cash out. If that's your kind of conversation, subscribe to Artificial Talks and hang with us again.